Wonderful to have you along with us on this Monday edition of 2020. If you are just joining our conversation, you're joining into one all about a revolutionary view of the age of fossils. Our special guest today is an expert on how the Earth's surface is formed and changed by rivers and by the movement of tectonic plates and by the powerful movement of oceans, air and ice. He's travelled the world collecting data, analysing the rugged landscapes in the most amazing places, and he's drawn some serious conclusions that challenge established thinking. We'll have a special focus today on the formation of fossils, and there are some new facts that have come to light that challenge the mainstream thinking around fossils and their formation. Our special guest is Dr Ron Neller. He is a geomorphologist who once was a supporter of geological evolution. Now he's part of the team at Creation Ministries International. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. In fact, Ron, let's keep some calls coming through here. Listeners that have been waiting patiently. Let's take a call from Lawrence in Perth, WA. Hey, Lawrence, welcome along.
Oh, thank you very much. I understand that before Noah's flood, the climate on the Earth was more uniform, but after the flood, the climate became much colder, such as at higher latitudes and at the North and South Pole. But where do the ice ages fit in with the Earth's history?
Good question. Ron, thoughts here for Lawrence?
There certainly was an ice age after the global flood. And we have a lot of articles on that, particularly written by Michael Ord. So if you go on our website, creation.com, you will see a truckload of articles there for you to look at that particular climate change after the flood event. But we would argue there's only one one ice age period. And I must admit that I was once in Finland and looking at moraines and other features of ice ages, and they all look very similar and belonging to one ice age. And I said, so why does everybody here say there's so many different ice ages, and every moraine they see, they give it a different name? And the answer was quite cheeky. It was, well, every person wants an ice age named after them. And so it was interesting. But we would argue that there is evidence of only one ice age. And it was significant in particularly the northern hemisphere, not so much in the southern hemisphere. And yes, now I can't comment on the period before the flood because firstly, we were not there. We do have a number of articles hypothesising and arguing various options. But from my perspective, if I'm not there and can't see it, I tend to steer away from those sort of hypotheses or ideas.
Lawrence, anything further to add?
Oh, no, thanks for that. That's cleared up that. Thank you very much.
Lawrence in Perth, WA, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Before we take another call, though, it's interesting, isn't it, that in all of the discussions around climate change and people reflecting on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years, I don't hear it reflected very often, the thought of a recent ice age that followed the flood. Any thoughts here from you on the time that you might think that ice age happened? Well,
the current paradigm has to be that it occurred a long time ago. You have to accept that from a scientific point of view, but it's not proven from a scientific point of view. They use dating techniques and so on that are quite flawed. I will admit that as a scientist, even though I had used carbon-14 and potassium argon and thermoluminescence, I actually turned away from them before I became a Christian because they're highly unreliable. They're very unreliable, and so I did not trust them anymore. But coming back to your question then, yeah, it's a belief system that it is old. I don't accept that. I think the morphologic evidence, the sedimentologic evidence and so on would indicate that it was only a few thousand years ago, say 4,000 years ago.
That's an incredible bit of evidence that you can take into a conversation around Noah's flood, this catastrophic cataclysmic flood that we're talking about as the formation of fossils and a following ice age. So 1-800-316-316 if you've got a question for our special guest today. Steve is in Riverview, Ipswich in Queensland. Hey Steve, welcome along.
Thanks Neil, how are you?
Very well. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Okay, so the formation of fossils is very quick. Excuse me a minute, I've got a timer going. Right. Sorry. The
That's good
formation
timing.
of fossils is good on you, Neil. You're a good dad joker.
There you go. Steve, I don't want to interrupt you.
Yes. Yes. All right. How about the formation of diamonds? Is that quick?
Diamonds.
Good question. I think I'll have to send you to creation.com to get the latest on that. I would say yes. I would say yes.
All right.
I would not say it's short period because most of what we see in terms of ore, coal and so on, and those sort of,
Yep.
we're seeing a complete restructuring of the Earth features, the landforms and so on. So
Yes.
now, again, I'm not an expert in diamonds. My wife would like me to be an expert in diamonds, but I'm not. So I would go to the creation.com and have a look at a couple of the mineralogists who actually have written on diamonds. They'll bring you up to speed with that one. So sorry there, Steve.
Am I allowed a couple more questions?
Yes.
One more question?
Yes. Fire away, Steve.
Okay. The formation of stalactites and stalagmites, I know, is being experimented by John, that it can become very quick instead of millions of years that they're raving on about. So can you comment on that, please?
I agree. There's my comment. It can be very quick. It has been monitored in a number of places and can be extremely quick. So I don't have a problem with that. Again, if you'd like to read something from a cave expert, we've got a chap, particularly overseas, who writes a lot on that and will give you the rates of formation and so on. But I have no problem whatsoever in all that I read, all that I've seen, that they can be created in a quite rapid period of time. And we've done that experimentally as well.
Yep.
Takes away, doesn't it? You got a feel for the tour guide who's taking you through the cave system and wants to argue millions and millions of years for the formation of those stalactites and stalagmites. If they were only formed rapidly over a few thousand, it takes all the romance out of doing the sort of historic tour, doesn't it?
That's when my wife asked me to be quiet when I'm on those tours.
Steve, did you
more
say you
quick
had another one?
question?
Yes, go for another one.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Uluru, our famous tourist centre. I've seen the thing on the website and had some information, but I'd love you to comment on it since you are an expert on this field.
Yes, Uluru is a sedimentary rock, by the way, sandstone and so on. It actually is not, when you look at many rocks, when you look at particularly cuttings, you'll see horizontal layers where sediment is laid on top of sediment and then more sediment is laid on top of that. But occasionally in the earth shifting, which would have occurred after the flood, you will actually get them tilted. Now, the actual Uluru is standing almost vertical. So the sedimentary layers go up and down through the rock, not across the rock, if you can understand what I'm saying there. In other words, it's a sedimentary layer that's been tilted at right angles and now goes deep into the earth as well. All you're seeing there is the top element of it.
That's really significant, isn't it? Because if you just think of that, because you can get that image in your mind, that Uluru, being a sedimentary rock, is tilted, it must have taken a major cataclysmic event to tilt the rock. Is that just drawing, what are your thoughts around that?
I think the real question comes back to time, or how long it took. The argument will always be that it could be a slow process. I would say no, it's a rapid process, and I do so now from a Christian point of view. So one of the Psalms where God says, I will raise the earth and lower the sea floor. At the time of the flood. And so in that raising of the earth, there would have been some, cataclysmic, formations formed. And particularly if you go on our creation.com website, you'll see that Taz Walker has written many articles on incredible features in Australia that have been just torn apart and tilted and warped and so on. So all of that would have occurred at the raising of the land in order to drain the flood waters off and the lowering of the sea floor. So yes, we would expect to see a lot of sedimentary rocks horizontal, but in many cases they are actually vertical as well.
Steve, have we exhausted your questions?
Oh, no, but, I better give someone else a go.
You better. Okay, well, thank you so much for your call.
Thank you, Steve.
Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Alex, let's see if I can get Alex. Yes, Alex is in Melbourne. Hey, Alex, welcome.
Oh, hello there. Yes, I'm just wondering about the Ice Age, if you can explain a bit more about that and what parts of the Earth were affected, please.
A good question, Alex, because there is often a perception that the whole Earth was affected, and it was not. Essentially, you're talking about North America, Canada, and parts of the USA. In Europe, you're talking about parts of, particularly the Scandinavian countries and the northern and central parts of England, those sort of areas, and of course Siberia as well, were actually covered in ice. In the southern hemisphere, it was quite restricted. You would find parts of, for example, Chile in South America were covered, and so on. So it was not when we talk about a global ice age, it was not all over the planet. It was only in those areas where it extended out from the poles, and from our point of view, from looking at the morphological, sedimentological, or all sorts of other evidence, we would argue that ice age only occurred for somewhere in the period of 500 to 700 years, and so that's it's not a global ice age. It's a restricted one that would have lowered the seafloor. We don't disagree with the secular scientists here. It would have lowered the the sea level by about 80 metres, maybe even 100 metres, something like that. Hence, the continental shelves would have been exposed at that time. And so that would have allowed migration of people, migration of species of animals, and all sorts of things. It really would have connected much of the continents together for that 500 to 700 year period after the flood.
Alex, anything further to add there?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. 1-800 316 316 if you'd like to join in our conversation. And just what comes to mind from me when you talk about that ice age that followed the flood, if you're going to have peoples who are disseminated around the world, then you need to have all sorts of ice or land bridges between continents to make that happen. So when we talk about where people groups have come from, and let's even just say Australian Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders, we're talking about that being the way that you would have seen the movement of people groups post-flood.
Correct, Neil. Whether it was complete land between all of them, yes, there would have been much more land. But if there were strips of water, they would have been narrow and quite shallow as well. So it would have allowed migration of peoples in that way. Now, we do know that some peoples have migrated through using boats and so on, but the majority of people connecting around the world during an ice age would have simply been through walking where we can't walk today. And certainly Indonesia would have been an absolutely wonderful pathway for people to come, and hence I would argue then that's where the Aboriginals did come through that pathway there at that time.
And challenging for some to hear creationist thoughts on the age of the earth and therefore the age of the people groups and how long they've been in particular places. And we won't get into anything controversial today because we're talking about fossils, but yes, the arrival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia has to be in a biblical view only relatively thousands of years, not tens of thousands.
I agree, and it all comes back to we are all one blood, and that's the most important point of it. We are all of one blood, and we all come from the same source. And it's simply the timing of the migrations that occurred it can be an argumentative point in the media today, but I would argue that it did occur after the flood, because after the flood there was only 8 people anyway that had to begin that process of repopulating the earth.
And from 8 people, you can go to very large population very quickly. That's quite significant. The way that, breeding like rabbits, you might say.
Exactly. And in fact, if the earth was, and if the planet was much, much older and humans had been around for a long time, I'd ask the question is where are the burial grounds? We would have seen billions of people in all of those periods of time, more than billions, but we don't find evidence of it. We find evidence of it going back to about 4,000 years, 4,500.
Let's come back to fossils and the rapid way that the pressure has to come on those fossils for their formation. When we're thinking of a global flood, the water on the surface of the earth, and I imagine I've thought this through myself and have my own questions about that, it wouldn't have been just a nice calm waters, would it? Because the way that tidal movements happen, with that amount of water on the face of the earth, is that enough pressure to do this sort of cataclysmic fossil formation that we're talking about today?
The turbulence would have been incredible, the velocities and so on, particularly when you model that from let's just say we took a planet which had only an ocean on it. Under the existing circumstances, the velocity speeds and turbulence would have been incredible at that time. But I will come back to the sedimentary point there. The sediments would have been torn apart at the beginning of the flood, not at a later period. So it's in the initial turbulence, as the earth bursts forth and the rains poured down, that is when sediments are most susceptible to be eroded. And that's the period when sediment does move. If you look at any flood today, sediment is at the beginning of the flood, not at the end of the flood. And so hence fossilization, or the deposition of the burial of organisms, I would argue, would have occurred fairly early in the flood period. Anything else left floating around for a year, it becomes decomposed. So what we see then is not an evolutionary sequence of death. We see a drowning sequence, a flood sequence of death.
It was brutal and violent, you could say, what was happening in that flood and post-flood era. Hey, taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's see if we can squeeze in one more. Herma is in Broken Hill. Hello, Herma. Welcome.
Hello. I've just had a comment about the stalactites, how quick they can grow, because about, 20, 25 years ago, our water quality was really, really bad. And neighbours of mine had a drip on their air cooler, and within 8 days, a 10-centimetre long stalactite formed on that corner there. So,
Emma, you're saying that your home is actually a laboratory, and it's. Hey, let's get a thought here, because this is something that people can observe even in their own homes, Ron.
Yes, and thank you very much for bringing that to our attention and showing that in your own home you can do that. It's another line of evidence that this is a rapid process, can be a rapid process.
1-800-316-316. Thank you to Herma for that comment. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. I want to ask you about what this means for us, because for a lot of people there might be a fascination with hearing some new scientific breakthrough that changes what the establishment has been thinking. Where ought this lead for us in our own thinking, Ron, around what we think about the validity and the authenticity of a biblical account of the flood and what that might mean for our faith and how we pursue God? Any thoughts here from you?
From a faith point of view, I think it's extremely important. There is a growing perception that the book of Genesis is not accurate, that it has elements of Mesopotamian or other sources in it. As a non-Christian, having accepted that the flood did occur, I then no longer argued with the book of Genesis. I thought, okay, the book of Genesis, the flood had been challenged throughout my entire life as not occurring. I now accepted as a scientist that it had occurred. I therefore felt when I gave my life to Christ, should I argue about the rest of the book of Genesis, or should I simply accept it as being absolutely accurate? And so I think it's important to us that when we look at the book of Genesis in particular, because that is the foundation of the Bible. I mean, let's be honest here. That in there we're shown who God is, who we are. We committed a sin. We changed everything. The rest of the Bible then is trying to explain how and showing us how God is getting us out of this situation. So if we reject the book of Genesis, I find that extremely difficult for us as Christians. So from a flood point of view, I just said, well, if that is proven, I'm not going to argue about the rest of the book of Genesis. And I accepted then the rest of it. And that has just been a real blessing to me to not have to argue with myself or argue with God over what he told me.
Okay, taking one more call. We'll squeeze one last one in. Ty is in Western Australia. Hey, Ty, welcome along.
Hi, Neil. How are you? Thank you.
Very well.
I just wanted to know about the four rivers that come out of Eden: Pishon, Gihon, and Tigris and Euphrates. I heard that there were still trenches pertaining to those rivers. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I think because the Earth we see today has no resemblance. I assume you're referring to the four rivers prior to the flood. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, but the Earth was completely restructured. The continents today do not bear any resemblance to what was there prior to the flood. It was a complete remapping of the world, and the continents, the oceans, all were remapped. And we see that because sedimentary rocks are prominent across the entire planet. So we know that basically most of the planet was restructured. Even when you look at the mountains today, if you look at the Himalayas or the Andes or the Rockies, they are sedimentary rocks by and large, and hence they were created during the flood. So they did not exist prior to the flood, they were created after the flood. So basically I would argue that any landform that we imagine occurred before the flood, that's it, it's our imagination only. There is no real record of that. I'd argue that from a geomorphic point of view, that's not possible.
Ty in WA, thank you so much for your call. We do have to put a line under calls now, and it's just been a very fascinating conversation this hour. And for listeners who are thinking, well, what is the evidence for the biblical flood? And there's one dimension of that evidence that we've been talking about this past hour in the formation of fossils and the cataclysmic event that's necessary for the formation of fossils. So you might like to listen to this podcast again. It'll be on a podcast a little later on this afternoon. But for those who are wanting to take this a little deeper right now, you can. And let me point listeners to creation.com. And I said earlier, there's more than 10,000 articles that are searchable on the creation.com website. In fact, Ron tells me there's now as many as 15,000 searchable articles. And Ron, a lot of reliable science that people will be able to access when they go onto those articles. And so evidence around sediments, around fossils, dinosaurs. So if you type in your favourite topic around those sorts of things, you'll find all sorts of great detail.
Correct, Neil. In fact, I'd be cautious when I go onto the site. I wouldn't just type in the word flood. You'll get 2,000 articles. I would type flood when, how, where, those sorts of things. But no, today we are so delighted to be able to put 15,000 articles out there, written, by the way, for the community. Whilst they're written by top scientists around the world, they are written in a manner that is explaining that to the community, not to other scientists.
And of course, there's still some tertiary level publications that people can access if they want to go even deeper again and get into the technical side.
Correct. We do have a journal of creation. Most of the articles that will appeal to people will be from the magazine, which is written for them. In the journal, you will find some really good, deep materials if you are really keen to go deeper.
And no doubt you can get all sorts of things digitally online. Can you still get a hard copy of the Creation magazine?
Absolutely. Yes, you can still subscribe to that. And we have info bites and other features as well. Simple thing is to go onto our website and explore all that. Yeah, it's just you can register on site and sign up to anything you like.
And you'd be able to connect with Dr Ron Neller. In fact, Ron's got a very busy program. It's a huge year ahead. This is a big year for talking about creation. But creation.com is how you connect with Dr Ron Neller, a geomorphologist. There's a great team of fabulous speakers that you're able to access there too. Ron Neller, creation.com, thank you so much for taking some time to share these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil. It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.